welcome everybody to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast here on Game Wisdom, where he's in the art and science of games. I am Josh Blaser, and we have another developer interview lined up for this week's show. My guest is the project lead over at Spellcast Studios, who is currently working on an open world style RPG known as ArdenFall. And he is here to discuss that, RPG design in general, and we'll see where the conversation goes. And his name should be very easy for me to remember. So please welcome to the cast, Joshua Steinhauer. Sorry, butcher that last name.
All right, yes. Yeah, thank you for having me.
It is great to have you on, and my Discord keeps asking me, have I ran out of Joshes to invite to these podcasts? And the answer is no. There is an infinite number of Joshes who are in game dev. But it is a pleasure to have you on. Thanks again for, I think, one of your developers reach out to me about checking out the game and then getting in touch with you. And it's great to have you on as we are just getting to the beginning of the holiday end of the year break that everyone, or most normal people have. When it comes to game developers, it's kind of 50-50 when it comes to the holidays.
Yep, I'm still working.
So, with that said, to kind of get the ball rolling, since it's your first time on, could you talk a little bit about who you are, kind of like what your game dev background is, and what is ArdenFall for the people watching?
Yeah, so I'm Josh. I've been developing games for around 12 years now, ever since I was a little kid. I'm currently working at Valkyrie Entertainment, which is a studio under Sony. And yeah, my free time, most of my time is dedicated to ArdenFall, which is it's an open world RPG. Takes a lot of concepts from like Morrowind as well as the modern Fallout games, and which is, I would say, pretty unique indie team developing an open world. Yeah, puts a big focus on player choice through combat, exploration, dialogue, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And I was just telling Josh, you prefer Josh or Joshua? I just want to make
Josh
sure.
Is good.
Okay. I was just telling to Josh before we started this cast that my next book is going to be on RPG design. So I am certainly in a role-playing mood to chat about it. So I guess my first question then for you, kind of like as we were just talking about on our precast, so what kind of RPGs do you like? And then like how did that inspire you with ArdenFall?
For me, kind of my favorite type of RPGs are the Bethesda type of RPGs, as well as, Obsidian's New Vegas. For me, I started them as a kid, and the first-person perspective is important. The fact that it's open world and you can affect the world in a lot of different ways. I think the creation engine helps with that a lot. And not many games scratch that itch, and I think a lot of people feel that way, where nothing's quite the same as like a Bethesda title. Going beyond that, I like more classic RPGs as well. Everything from the original Fallouts to games that are less RPG. I've been playing Dwarf Fortress recently, which isn't an RPG, but it kind of blends into that space a little bit. So yeah.
And as I was just saying, like for me, I think I really gravitated towards like dungeon crawlers myself. This idea of, I think where I come at from RPG is kind of like the puzzle of building a party. Like I can spend like an hour or two, like in any kind of dungeon crawler, just figuring out, okay, what exactly is my party going to be? I'm that guy who, when I create a party, like it's my party for the rest of the play. Like I will not add another character. I will not change classes. Like I build like this meticulous, trying to break this game. And I think it's why I really love like the Etrian Odyssey games. I someday need to try like Wizardry, and there's a lot of JRPG inspired dungeon crawlers I've really grown to enjoy.
Yeah, especially with building a party. It's so commonly used in JRPGs.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, like the Bethesda style, I think to what you were just saying, that there really isn't anything else that quite scratches that itch. That is like one of the, I think, cornerstones of that style of like open world RPG. This idea that you can just kind of plop down into this world and it becomes your own, I think, personal sandbox. You can build your character however you want. You can go wherever you want. And again, like when we talk about something like with Skyrim, it is still, I think, one of the most played RPGs to this day.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's the best selling one as well.
Mm-hmm. So I guess for you, like, you may have kind of already answered this with enjoying like Bethesda style. Do you prefer RPGs that is more like? Do you like the idea of a party base, or do you like the kind of like solo? This is your character, do with him what you want kind of style.
Yeah, I think I prefer the I am the character. I guess another style would be here's a character, play them, like The Witcher.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that I don't like party games or I don't like those type of games, but yeah, I think I prefer the character where I can choose how they act, how they react to situations, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And definitely, like, the size and scope of these games is something to be appreciated. Like, even if we look all the way back to stuff like Ultima, Might and Magic, and kind of like first, second generation RPGs, they were still massive game spaces for their times. And while I was doing some research and looking up some like what people have said about, like, it's surprising to look at games from like late 70s, early to mid 80s as these like massive projects that you can explore.
Yeah, totally. It's really, I mean, there are games that came out then that are bigger than a lot of games that come out now. In a way, a lot of games have kind of been scoped down. It depends on the game, of course, but when you go for the realistic graphics, there's only so much you can do in a way, like in terms of like massive scale. And then there's the fact that sometimes a massive scale isn't necessarily good. Like, I don't know if you've played Daggerfall, which is the third game in the Elder Scrolls series. It's very different. It's insane. The scale is like the size of actual Britain. It's huge. And really the question is like, what do you gain from that? Answer, not. It's a lot of repetitive content, right? Because you have to be. Yeah. So there's that as well, but it is impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the scope of these games has been one of the things that has scared off a lot of independent developers over the years as well, because as you just said, these games take a lot of resources. Even if you use, or I know a lot of developers will use a proc gen in terms of just kind of creating like the base layer or the topography. I can't pronounce that word, you know what I'm saying, but kind of like that overall layout. But even then, it takes a lot to make even just an okay version of this game. And I do feel, I'm just wondering if your thoughts are on this as well. I do feel like kind of like Bethesda set the standard so high, kind of like what Nintendo did with Mario and platformers, that kind of scared off a lot of developers from, trying to compete with the king in this respect.
Yeah, I agree, and I think there's from an indie's perspective, you probably should not try to make a Bethesda game. It's like trying to make an MMO. Like, I'm doing it, but I probably shouldn't be, kind of thing. Yeah, it takes an insane amount of resources. You have to be, and when you're smaller, you have to, even when you're bigger, you have to cut things. Like Skyrim isn't like the most like cinematic experience ever, right? It doesn't try to be. Well, it kind of tries, but it fails in many regards, and that's okay because you can't have like God of War graphics with the Skyrim-sized world, right? I mean, not even with the most modern, massive teams.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's really hard. It takes a lot of people. It takes a lot of time and planning, and it makes everything hard. Basically, open worlds is development on hard mode, where every single thing, design. Oh well, like in a game where you have a certain number of weapons, like, oh, every character has a sword. You can design around that. You can make a dungeon so you can make it fun. This dungeon's fun because we know everyone has a sword and like a Zelda-style shooty hook thing. But in an open world game where you could be anyone, maybe you have magic, maybe you don't have a sword. Uh-oh, what do? It causes issues. And that's just one example.
Yep, and of course, how do you balance your game around like set or specific encounters? Oh, this dragon is immune to fire magic, but what happens if you have a player who is 100% fire magic? What do they do when they get to that? Oh, the game just ends for them. And
Right, totally.
it just becomes a lot more of a challenge. And again, I think it's where kind of like the prestige that Bethesda has earned came from. Because, I mean, they were really, like, the first to do kind of, like, a real-time open-world RPG. And even, like, despite the bugs and, you know, people, you know, always having, like, the memes of you wait, like, 6 months to play a Bethesda game, they really do stand the test of time.
Yeah, they do. And, of course, modding communities add a lot as well. Their engine is the most moddable engine ever, basically. Like, if you look at, like, Nexus games, whatever it is, basically, they hold top spot. Like, all of their games are top spot, which I think also heavily contributes. The open world plus being able to modify the open world.
Mm-hmm. And to Thorn's question in chat, I think this is an interesting one. How do you feel about dynamically leveling or changing enemies with the character? Because again, that is one of the more polarizing elements. I think that and durability systems in games are probably the two most like debated game mechanics we've seen.
Yeah, good question. For me, I definitely do not. I prefer the non-leveling to the player, and it's for the reasons why most people say the same stuff. Where it feels like you're not growing. You're just kind of always going to be the same strength. You're fighting the enemies that are all the same to you, so it's always going to feel the same. Skyrim's is better than Oblivion's. Oblivion's was crazy, where if you like screwed up your build, you'd be fighting enemies that were like gods, no matter where you went. So Skyrim definitely improved, but yeah, I definitely prefer Breath of the Wilds if you do go for a level scaling, where you still find enemies that are really hard. Now Skyrim does have a few. Like sometimes you'll run into an enemy that is actually hard. Like for me, one of my core memories for Skyrim, and I tell everyone this, everyone I know knows this story. I was first time I was going on the up the mountain, up the steps, and I found I don't even remember what enemy it was. Just some dangerous enemy, and just destroyed me. It just decimated me. And I like, okay, so I got better. I got new weapons. I grinded a bit, and I went up there and destroyed him. Yeah, it just feels awesome. And that's something you lose for most of Skyrim. Yeah, I think it was a snow troll. Yeah, you lose that, and it becomes a samey experience.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect that I like in games that don't have scaling is that it really allows you to punch up in a way. Like, one of my favorite strategies in any of the Dark Souls games is the idea of finding something that should be way over your level, or something you shouldn't be able to fight, and figuring out a way to deal with them to get, 5-10 times more resources than you would just fighting normal enemies. And I think, to what you were just saying, like, when you have that scaling, it makes the world, I think, feel... I'm not sure what the right word to use here. It feels very generic, or it feels almost like a amusement park ride that no matter where I go, it just so happens every enemy is level 10. And I do like games that, and like Breath of the Wild, that idea that, hey, you can be wandering around fighting low level goblins and whatever like the taller guys were, and then you run to like one of like those guardian sentinels with like the death laser that targets you, and it gives it, I think, that sense of liveliness to it.
Yeah, totally agree. It makes things change. You can see things change in the world. It makes the world feel more dynamic as well. Well, like, yeah, just you feel yourself growing. You feel the world growing in the sense because you're making a different effect in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree that's a good way of putting it, though. It's like an amusement park otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So I guess when talking about open world RPGs, I of course have to ask your opinions on that little game known as Elden Ring that everyone here has never ever played. And like, Elden Ring is one of those games that it will probably still be talking about into 2023 and probably into 2024 whenever From Software returns to that model, and how it really just like some people have felt like it goes back to kind of like the older style of an open world RPG. That idea that you are just put in this world and asked to explore, as opposed to a lot more games that are more, I guess, again, more curated. Okay, you want to go over here first, and now you do this, and now we're going to tell you to go collect 5 of this. So I'm curious, again, as someone who's played so many RPGs and open world style ones, what was your impression of playing Elden Ring, or did you play Elden Ring yet?
I actually haven't yet. It's on my list, and I
Mhm.
will be getting to it. But I've heard a lot of good stuff about it in terms of its open world level design.
Mhm.
Um, I'm obviously not able to talk about it a lot, but the things I know about it are its lore, the fact that the lore is ridiculously deep, and the way the game teaches you about the lore, not directly, but instead through kind of hidden ways, which is really interesting. And obviously the fact that the world expands, like you start out in a small area, and then all of a sudden, oh, the world's like 10 times bigger than I thought it was. And yeah, I mean, it's very clear that this game is popular, and it's a type of game that I've heard kind of goes against the norms of the modern open world design.
Mhm. And actually, I think that takes me another question for you. Like with ArdenFall and with like your own style of preferring like open world RPGs, what do you think about like the level of guidance or onboarding in some of these games? Because one of the things I was looking at when looking up like older RPGs like Ultima, My Imagine, and so on is that they do very little handholding. To the point, of course, that going back to what we were saying with Oblivion, you can easily screw your character up if you don't build it properly or if you don't invest in certain skills or character attributes. And there's been a lot of discussions. I know I've read a lot of pieces by, I think, game designer Ernest Adams. I believe wrote a lot about RPGs, and maybe it was also, why am I forgetting his name? The one who does, Jeff Vogue, that's his name. I almost forgot him. About kind of how a lot of RPGs feel like they front load a lot of the important decisions before you can even start playing. So you're almost kind of, taking 20 steps back before you even see the game. So what are your thoughts on kind of like, I guess, good or proper onboarding when it comes to these styles of games?
Yeah, that's like the ultimate question. It really is, and it's hard. We've recently released our demo, and we learned that we weren't onboarding enough. And it's kind of the easy thing to say, oh, no hand, I don't like hand holding. Bad, bad. Just no hand holding, right? It's easy to say, and it's like it makes you seem cool and fun. Like I always used to say that, but I realized the vast majority of players need hand holding to an extent. There's such thing as too much for sure, and a lot of AAA games do it too much. But if you one important part of game design and especially like a tutorial is communication. If players don't know something, then the feature might as well not even be there, right? That's kind of an issue if players have no way of knowing. Um, some games have kind of embraced it. Like I would say Minecraft is an example of a game that's almost embraced its non-existent tutorial. Only it took years and years for them to add a way to access um, the recipes, right?
Yeah.
Or like the crafting recipes, which is hilarious. Like basically what that means is either A, you're randomly putting things into boxes, which no one did, or B, you're looking up it on the wiki. It's almost asking you to go on the wiki. It's kind of funny, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just it's more interesting. Yeah, I definitely think the hand holding is in the middle. And hand holding doesn't mean forced as well. There's always the fact that you can design the game so the player doesn't want to be handheld, they can just leave. Um, but yeah, you need to be able to communicate. You need to communicate things like what should you probably be doing, right? Like here's a main quest. This is probably what you should be doing if you don't know what to do, because a lot of players don't know what to do when they're starting a
Hmm.
game, and they want to be told. Some players want to. I'm the type of player that just wants to run off, and that's cool. But a lot of players aren't like that. They just want to know what am I supposed to be doing here? This is a new experience. I don't even know what this game's about exactly. So you need to be able to communicate that information.
Hmm. And especially, I think, when you do any kind of character customization or character
Oh yeah.
creator in these games. Because,
Yes, yes, yeah. You were talking about the front loading, and I agree. It's totally true, including in ArdenFall, where to an extent, where we show you these stats. It's like, oh, intelligence. Okay, well, you kind of know what intelligence is because if you've played other RPGs before, but it's still kind of guesswork, and it is really funny. It's kind of like it feels like a flawed core part of an RPG, and some games have it so you can like play the game before, or you can respec your stats afterwards, like once you leave the starting dungeon or something, which is better, but it still kind of feels like a band-aid. I don't know I have no solution to that. I have no idea, but it is a funny flaw, I would say.
Yeah, man, I think that's one of the reasons why I gravitated so much towards like JRPG design and a lot of the dungeon crawler design, where everyone starts like level 1. All their stats are like equalized, and then you're free to build it out over the course of how many hours you want to play it. Because I've tried playing a lot of open world and just a lot of like traditional style CRPGs, and whenever I'm treated to like 30 different stats and skills to apply points to, my mind just locks up. Like, what the heck am I supposed to do? I don't even know what the game looks like yet in the game, and you're asking me to build this character.
Yeah, totally. That's a problem. I agree.
And to Thorn's question, what do you think is the weakest aspect of open world games right now?
I'm probably going to say kind of the obvious thing, but the style of it's more to open world games. Yeah, this is not RPGs in general. So the Ubisoft approach, where it's the classic thing that everyone talks about, where you have this massive world that you can really just do 6 things, but again and again and again, and they even put it all on the same map. That's kind of the obvious thing where it's like, why at this point? Like, what's the point?
Let's see. We can't say combat. I think for me, like, again, like a lot of stuff that I prefer when I play my games feels kind of like counter to what we call about like traditional open world RPGs, or just like traditional RPGs in general. Is that I prefer, if I'm going to play it, either one like complete and utter control over my character, as in I want to build this character exactly to my specs, I want complete control, or I prefer, I guess it's actually a question for you, like, do you like action RPG design? Like, do you like games that, like, with, like, the Elder Scrolls series, and even go to, like, Fallout 3 and 4, it's that kind of, like, real-time control, but the RPG is kind of like the underlying foundation of it. So it's not technically, like, a full-on action game, but it still has those, like, action elements to it.
Yeah, I definitely like the approach of action RPGs. I would say technically the turn-based RPGs are better if you're wanting a true RPG experience, because it's RPGs are almost designed for, like, the foundational concept of an RPG, like the origin of it, is essentially turn-based. So I think turn-based and non-turn-based. I mean, I guess we already do have a separation of genres with action RPG, and I think that's good because it is different. But I do prefer action. Yeah. It does cause issues, especially like with Morrowind, you'd have the issue where the game's built on a D&D like system, so you have missing, but then you're swinging your sword and it goes through enemies, and people hate that, and I understand that. I understand the annoyance of that. You have this kind of disconnect between what makes sense in a turn-based game and what makes sense in an action RPG. And the same, even worse, is like guns. Guns and RPG, it's hard. It's hard. And like Fallout, you can see them struggling, where you have like misses. Same thing, same issue with misses, and just other things like that, where it's just a bit odd. Like, why is my gun doing more damage because I'm stronger, right? With a sword, you can kind of make it work. At the end of the day, you just have to wave, just hand wave it away. It's a game, whatever. But it is pretty funny.
I remember that with Vampire the Masquerade. I think it was Redemption. I think that was the sequel, where like if you put enough points to your unarmed stat, your punch does like 70 times more damage than shooting someone with a shotgun in the head. And yeah, it's always that weird, and it's that kind of like weird connection between the like tabletop RPG rules and trying to make it into like a real time or quasi real time experience.
Yep. It is. It's a funny thing.
So with ArdenFall, so you talked a few minutes ago about it's going to be like your take on open world design. So I guess what I guess what are you doing? Like, what's standing out like, for people watching? What do you feel is going to make ArdenFall special for the genre?
I would say one of its biggest aspects is its dialogue system. We take a lot of ideas from specifically Fallout New Vegas in the sense of being able to role play through dialogue, being able to have just make different decisions that can actually affect the world. And we're trying to take that a lot further. Um, in one way, it's actually a good, like, we don't have voice acting. And that's actually given us some unique takes because we can have dynamic text. So an NPC might say, if you're a certain gender, they might mention it. If it's raining, they might mention it. There's so many different variables that can be used in the dialogue system, and that's like not super important. That doesn't change the world. Like, oh wow, they mentioned it's raining, but I do think it's a good addition to the fact that like the world's dynamic. It feeds into replayability, which we're big on. In terms of choices and actually making meaningful choices, we've done things where you have traits, and then those traits will unlock certain choices. And that can change different quests. Basically, you can change the world, is the idea. And if you want to do something, you should be allowed to do it. Like, you can kill everyone in the game. Quest giver, doesn't matter. It'll probably end a quest, right? If you kill a quest giver, that quest's over, but you can. And that's the dialogue, I would say. It's just branching dialogue that lets you do stuff. And if you want to do it, you should be allowed to do it. And hopefully we accounted for that. Beyond that, in terms of open world design, we're not trying to make a vast open world where you're just running through fields on a horse. There are no mounts. The idea is that you're expected to be at a pretty consistent speed, and we're trying to keep the world compact. It's still big. It's not a tiny game, but it's meant to be compact, so we don't waste your time, for one thing. There are fast travel points, but you can't fast travel anytime you want. And then another important part that's also choice-oriented is its sandbox combat design. This isn't like done. If you play the demo, you definitely have that aspect where you have throwing potions that can affect potions on monsters. You have throwing daggers that could be enchanted, and swords and bows and spells. The idea is that you have this tool set. You'll be better at certain things than others, which is important to us. If you put your stats into strength, that's important. You'll be good at swords. You won't be good at spells. And we want to continue fostering that, where we're bringing in new tools and new ways to play, which fits into, we were talking about like dangerous enemies, and that fits into that. The idea that if you see an enemy that's like too dangerous, maybe you can figure something out. Maybe you have like a really good enchanted throwing dagger that you'll use once that'll get you through. And I've watched a few YouTube videos of people playing ArdenFall, and that's happened before. I'm like, yes, that's what we want. Yeah.
And going back to what you were just saying a second ago with regards to letting the player play it their way, as you were saying about, I think, like 10 minutes or so about balance, what is your approach to kind of, I guess, balancing the world around multiple choices? Because another thing that is now famous from, like, Oblivion, I think could have been in Skyrim as well, are the ways that you can just break those systems. Like, if you stay in one spot and jump enough times, you'll just raise your agility up to super high, or with the right craftables, you can just create, like, a cloak or an armor that just gives you permanent invisibility. And different developers have different takes, again, on just, how much do we just let someone, take a sledgehammer to the balance of our game?
Yeah, our take is, if the player tries to break it, they should be allowed to. If they're not trying, they shouldn't break it. Because if they're not trying to break it, they're just trying to have an experience. And if the game's that's just called unbalanced, right? If all of a sudden they're just OP, that's not really fun anymore because they weren't trying to be OP. Yeah. So, but if they want to, they should be allowed to. We don't have a crafting system. Crafting systems are, like Morrowind was known for that, where you could infinitely stack intelligence potions essentially to become a god. And we don't have a crafting system, so you can't break that. But yeah, there's definitely ways. You can For example, when you create your character, you can make your attributes max to 10, and your attributes never change. But you technically can boost it infinitely because, potions will make it above. So technically, if you do tricky stuff, another thing that we found out players were doing was if you jump onto like a slightly tilted surface, like not a perfectly vertical surface, you could just jump. You could basically climb surfaces. And we're like, oh, that's not good. And then I'm like, wait, what if we make this a feature? So that's actually something we're looking into it, like making it so if your skills are high enough, you can just climb stuff.
Just to climb over everything is always a fun thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And with kind of setting up like the world, as you were saying a few seconds ago, with regards to you want to make it compact but still big. In terms of like world generation, are you using like a procedural generation to like build like the underlying, or like how is like I guess how is the actual building of the world done for ArdenFall?
Yeah, we've definitely experimented with procedural generation as a base. Oh yeah, no problem. But yeah, we've basically landed on essentially hand painted world terrain specifically, and then everything else is hand created as well. There is something to be said about using proc gen for like specifically terrain. There's a reason why pretty much everyone does it, but currently we've settled on hand painted. For specific details, we do use a you could call it proc gen. It's kind of pushing it, where we might have a building, and this building has these different walls and panels and stuff, and those can be swapped out, scrolled through essentially, but also randomized. And inside this house, you might have a decor area, and inside that decor area, there's like 10 different options for different tables. And inside of that, there's like different options on top of the tables. So when you drop into the house, it just randomizes everything, which can act as a good start because you can slap in a house, and then the designer can go in and clean it up essentially. So, oh, I don't want that there, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But oh yeah, I guess you asked specifically like, how do we build our world? And we're honestly kind of still figuring that out. We're refining rather. When we built the demo, it took quite a while to do. So we're working on basically making that more efficient and just speeding up that process. But generally it's just basically block it out, see if it works in terms of distances, which is really important. It's often so easy to make something way too big, unless you actually go into the world and like run around and be like, oh, okay, it's so easy. And after that, it's just lots of testing, lots of iteration. Eventually, you'll start putting in real meshes, but that takes a while. Yeah.
And what was kind of like the inspiration for like the aesthetics or like the overall look of the game?
In terms of aesthetics, the reason why we went this way is because I wanted to avoid the kind of generic RPG look. Usually when you think RPG, you think like European medieval. And then obviously there's nothing wrong with that, but it is what you see often. So to make it different, we decided, okay, let's make a world not inspired by European medieval, and instead Asian. We also take inspiration from Arabic and other cultures, tons of different other cultures as well. And that feeds into the culture, not just the aesthetics as well, whether it's like the religions or anything like that. And you had another question. Yeah, aesthetics. Yeah, aesthetics also goes into the art style. The art style was figured out because originally the art style was going to be more like Daggerfall, which is kind of similar to Doom, I guess. So pixelated, everything would be pixelated. But we didn't have a pixel artist. So we're like, okay, let's not do that. And that slowly evolved towards a low poly design, mainly because it's necessary. Pumping out thousands of models with a tiny team, basically a few modelers, basically meant we have to cut something, right? And going for the low poly look, basically we cut UV mapping, we cut textures. We've learned that the art style is kind of a love and hate thing, where some people are just like, yeah, this is great, and some people just hate it because they want the realistic look. And I understand, but I think the world looks good. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it also definitely has to fit with kind of like the tone of the world itself, because we were talking a lot about Elder Scrolls, but one of the games you mentioned, Fallout, we've also seen a lot of traditional style RPGs go for like a futuristic or more of a sci-fi angle with their own aesthetics and tone. And it really, I think, or the RPG genre as a whole lends itself to a wide variety of these different aesthetics.
Yeah, yeah, totally. We went for fantasy because I prefer fantasy. um, in terms of aesthetics and world building. That's really it.
And with like ArdenFall, with the combat itself, this is something again that we've seen many different games have very different takes. For like the melee, like how involved or how in depth are you planning or you're approaching for the game?
Yeah, since our game is first person oriented, so basically we assume you're going to be in first person. You can go in third person, but that heavily restricts melee specifically. It makes it very hard to design for.
Mm-hmm.
So that already means we're going to have a less deep system for melee. Currently, our system is pretty simple, pretty dirt simple, and we do want to extend it. We're actually talking about that like today about how we can extend it, make it feel less repetitive and just deeper. Um, yeah, yeah, like it's interesting what first person does. It makes it so since you don't have depth perception in a video game, you have one screen, unlike how you have two eyes. It's really hard to know how far away an enemy is away from you. So whether you're able to hit them or not. In third person, you know that instantly. You have that information available for you. So that alone makes it very difficult to have like enemies that are too small because then they need to be basically right up to your face. If enemies have attacks that are like wide, they'll clip into your camera. How do you solve that? There's a lot of interesting stuff that you don't think about when you're playing a first person game, but then it becomes very relevant, especially melee. Guns are awesome in first person, obviously. There's like it's the best way to have for the best type of view if you have guns, I would say. But for melee, it's definitely difficult.
Oh yes, for sure. I think it's probably why I gravitate a lot towards like the Dark Souls, Demon Souls style
Yep.
of action RPG, because it gives you that very easy to understand relation of, hey, my sword can only swing this far. I know exactly where to hit it. And again, like who here hasn't played a first-person RPG where you swing your sword and you're wondering, why am I not hitting this guy? You know, he's like right here in front of me. Why is this not hitting him? Let me just get like this close to him and maybe we'll actually hit him.
And what's funny is if you have a normal sword and you want the damage to be like at the sword point, you will do that 100% of the time. Because that's you think you're closer to the enemy than you are in a first person game. So yeah, you have to cheat, and we did the same thing where your damage goes much farther uh, than it looks because yeah, that exact issue happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Thorn was asking like sweet spot stuff. Yeah, I've seen a few RPGs like try to do that and can be very weird in some of them. But I've played like a few action games that try that, even something like a active reload system, and it can be sometimes hard to pull that off in the heat of the moment.
Reload system.
Kind of like an active reload. I mean, something like Gears of War, where you like time your reload like the right moment.
Oh, okay, right. Okay, I see. Yeah.
I guess another question for you with regards to spells. You mentioned earlier about being able to like enchant weapons and things like that, and spell casting in RPGs like that is like its own like hour-long topic we could get into. Because there are some games that really let you go crazy with enchantments and putting stuff or applying various buffs or debuffs to your weapons. How are you approaching that with ArdenFall?
Yeah, in the demo, we don't have the ability for you to enchant your own weapon. You basically just find weapons that are enchanted. But we definitely like the ability to enchant your weapons. It obviously fits in the idea of making decisions. Um, in regards to spells, yeah, spells and enchantments.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one factor of spells in our game is there's kind of two separate concepts. There's the spell that's equipped, and there's the basically the quick slot spells. So the spell that's equipped is meant to be kind of like the spam spell. So like the fireball, just shoot the fireball, shoot, shoot, shoot. But then you have your tool bag of other spells that you're expected to use, and players catch on pretty quick where it's like, oh, I can shoot this frost spell that slows them down, and then I can spam fireball to do to because it'll take a long time for them to get me, and that's the kind of thing we're trying to do where it's less about the complexity of a certain spell or even like the destruction of a certain spell. It's more about how you mix spells, and then like how long's the cooldown for a certain spell, right? Like a really powerful spell like fireball might be only shootable once every 10 seconds. You have to time that. In terms of enchantments, we're actually doing a redesign right now, so it's experimental. We're kind of just fiddling with what works, and the current design in the demo is basically just this weapon does this thing, right? Like it will catch enemies on fire, and we found that that's kind of boring. It's a simple concept. So what we're trying out right now, and this is once again just experimental, is essentially a heart attack will actually do the enchantment. And the idea is that now that gives the player the ability to control when they want the enchantment to actually do its thing. And it also allows us to make it much more powerful. If we give you double X damage on a fire sword and every hit you get is double X, it's kind of unbalanced. And it's also just less fun. But if you get to swing your sword and it does double X, triple X damage, it's still balanced, but it has that more impact.
Mm-hmm. And are you able to kind of like mix and match enchantments, or is it kind of like one enchantment per piece of gear or or item?
Currently, it's one enchantment per weapon, but having for example, the throwing stars and throwing daggers, you do have the concept of multiple enchantments at once because you're holding a sword with enchantment and then you're throwing stars that do enchanted effects. Yeah, that's currently the way we're going. I'm probably going to make it so you can have two enchantments on a weapon. I think that's pretty fair and funner. Yeah.
And I guess like, what is your approach going to be to like consumable based items? Because another thing, as I'm sure anyone who's playing RPG knows of, is the hoarder syndrome. When it comes to a lot of these games, some games tend to try and fight it, making a lot of items as cheap as possible, or even something like the Dark Souls approach, where your healing potion, of course, regenerates after each bonfire. Other games just make it like full on, you must always be prepared to have like 99 arrows or have every bullet for your gun ready because you'll never know when you're going to run out.
Yeah. That's also a classic RPG issue. Fighting against the human mind. Our approach is partially just being difficult. Having those random enemies that are just really strong really gets players to just wipe through their horde, the horde, yeah, of potions and throwing weapons and whatever they have. That's honestly the biggest one. I guess another way you can do it is limiting carry weight, but that's almost like the opposite of fun, where you're basically forcing players to lose their cool stuff. Which cool. Now they're not hoarding anything, but now that's not fun. So that's probably not great for to solve this particular problem. Yeah. To Thorn saying no one likes carry weight.
Yeah.
No one likes carry weight, but it is important. The demo doesn't have carry weight, and we also give like way more items. We kind of wanted to give the players like kind of everything, like just so they can kind of experiment early on. Unless it's a demo, and it ends up being this, and that's kind of what happens when you have carry weight. If you can just carry infinite stuff, you'll just be this guy carrying 10,000 items, and at that point, that really makes hoarding bad because you wouldn't be able to find something you want to use even if you tried. Where do you even begin? And it also decreases the value of items. If you have 10,000, random potions, it makes potions feel garbage. So some kind of carry weight's good. I'm not like a person who thinks you should have like you should be able to carry like 2 items, like but a ceiling is important somewhere.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's always that travel and developers lets you like literally pick up like everything in the world. You can carry 500 wooden spoons, and here's 87 pairs of shoes. Why can you pick it up? Who knows? But someone will try and then wonder why can't I walk anymore? I've gone completely over my carry weight.
Yep. I like picking up everything. Fallout 4 actually did something really interesting with that, where it actually made junk a game mechanic. Because you'd have your settlement where you can build your stuff, and it would require resources. Where do those resources come from? The junk. It's genius. Like, it's honestly genius. Like, the junk already existed in the game design. Like, Fallout 3 had junk everywhere. But they actually added a new system that used that. And it also made a mini game where I'm like setting up robots or whatever. I needed copper. Copper, which was kind of rare. So I'd actually have to go out into the world to find junk that has copper in it. Like, that's crazy that they managed to add a new game inside of a game where it used to be that the junk was useless junk. So there are solutions.
Mm-hmm. I guess it actually takes me to another point. Like, what are your thoughts on like having that kind of like hub or home base? Because I know a lot of people really liked that. I think that was in Fallout 4 when they put in like your ability just to build your own little settlement. I always like systems like that in some of the games that I've played, but I can also see where it can become a little annoying having to constantly like go back and make sure that's working right and things are being done. But I guess for you, like, what are your thoughts on that kind of like home base system?
I like it. I definitely see why some people are annoyed by it, and it doesn't fit into every game.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not every open world game should have a home base. But if the game, if it works well with the game, I definitely prefer it. I like having my own. It fits in the idea of affecting the world. Fallout 4 is a very simple system. The building's cool, but it doesn't really do anything else. But still, it's fun, and it's fun to create stuff. I like Minecraft, it's one of my favorite games. So, if I can build stuff, I am happy.
And I guess with like going back to like open world RPG design in general, in terms of I guess like the pacing or structure they are aiming for with ArdenFall, as we've said, like there are some games that go for either all onboarding or like all guides. You must go here to here to here in that order. You're never going to win. While a lot of older games, especially like the Fallouts, kind of embrace that. Here's this whole world you can explore. We have this grand quest, but we're not going to exactly tell you you must go here to do this to then get to there to finish it. So, like, with, like, again, you don't have to spoil the story of the game here, but, like, what is kind of, like, the player's, like, objective in, like, ArdenFall? Like, what are they going to be doing in the game?
So our kind of solution right now is not to have an overarching story for the entire game. Like, your goal isn't to kill the dragon, for example. But we're working on the start of the game right now, so we're kind of going through this. But essentially, the current goal when the player plays the game for the first time, their goal will be to join a guild. And that means going to the biggest city in the game. So that's kind of their initial goal, is to join a guild, and then from then they'll have the guild storyline, whatever guild they choose, and you only can go to one. It locks you out of the others once you join one, which is important. So yeah, and there's several quests in the beginning town that kind of sends you in that direction, but you don't need to. Like, you don't need to join a guild. That's not required. But we are giving that direction because, in the demo we found people just not feeling connected to the world if they're not told, what am I kind of supposed to do?
I think that's actually another interesting point about the kind of like the segue that happened with RPGs following like the rise of the MMO in the 2000s. Was a lot of the MMOs were really billed as there's no grand story, there's no grand plot, just basically you're here in Star Wars or you're here in Middle Earth, and you can just kind of take your time and explore your leisure. And it is kind of like that very interesting dividing point of what you expect out of an RPG. Like again, like for someone like me as a dungeon crawler fan, I expect to grow in power. Like I don't care so much about living in this world. I care about, can I overcome the next big challenge or the next big boss. But then, of course, as I'm sure everyone here is well aware of, there are a lot of fans of RPGs for kind of like the lore and the exploration. They want to get themselves involved in this place. They don't want to, see you've gained plus 75 experience. They just want to, live here in this like universe and kind of see what comes out of it.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the beauty of the RPG genre, where it is really diverse. It just depends on what the game's focusing on. Some games focus on, dungeon crawling, right? Finding new loot, upgrading yourself. Other games focus on telling a certain story. It kind of just depends on what the player wants, which is great because then everyone will find something for them in the RPG space.
Mm-hmm. So, with kind of like the development of ArdenFall, how long has you and have you and your team been working on the game?
We've been working for over 5 years now. A lot of the beginning years was focused on building the tech. I am the only engineer on the team, so all on me. So a lot of work building all of the everything to make a game, right? Starting around 2 years ago ish is when we really started actually building out the world. Yeah.
So I guess like from a technical standpoint, again, I am not a programmer, so I'm not going to ask you too much super challenging stuff on that respect. But what has been, I guess, like the most challenging aspect of like building the tools or building the engine surrounding ArdenFall?
I would say the hardest aspect, or the hardest aspects, in no specific order, would be the scale of it causes a lot of issues in terms of engineering, where you have to be able to access data, certain types of data, anywhere, right? Like an NPC, right? You can't just throw him in a black box and he's on the other side of the world. No big deal, right? He's gone. Who cares? That's the easy way, and that's like a way a lot of games do it, and it's great. If you can do that, do that. But in an open world game where the quest system might just teleport them in at any time, or maybe it needs to modify them. Maybe they make you hate you now, right? Anything can happen, and that makes it really hard to do anything. Where who knows what the quests will want, right? What will the writers want to do next, kind of thing. Just the open-endedness of it all, and that combined with world streaming is another toughie. We're using Unity engine, which is a great engine, but it doesn't come with many tools built in. You basically have to do it all yourself. So that's a lot of just busy work, essentially building out those tool sets. And then the next hardest, I mean, yeah, that's probably it. Yeah, just the scale of it in terms of both like streaming it, all of the management of the data, and also just the design of different, the world structures essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can definitely see where that challenge is coming in. Again, the thing about, as you said, with RPGs, is that you're constantly having to keep track of all the data. What has the player done? What is their relationship to this person, to this one? And I think I played about like 30 minutes or so of the demo. This will have been maybe like last month or two. I saw that you had like the different factions. So how do factions interact with each other? How they interact with you? And again, it's definitely a few steps above playing like a platformer, where all you need to keep track of is, did the player, how much health do they have, or are they on the ground or not?
Yep, totally. Yeah, just for example, pulling a random example, relationship. So, what does this NPC think of the player, right? Like, should they attack him? Should they hug up and kiss him? Not actually, but like, how much do they like this player? There's a lot of things you have to check. Yeah, what factions are you in versus what factions are they in? Are there any sort of modifiers based on like effects? Is there some sort of quest modifying it? There's so many steps involved in just checking that. It's crazy how fast things get complicated. And when you're starting out, you think it's going to be a lot easier than it ends up being every time.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about that kind of like keeping track of everything, that takes me to another like UI question I want to have for you. One of the other aspects of RPG design, this is something especially I'm going to talk about in the book, is the amount of information you're trying to convey to the player at any one time. When we go back to kind of like the very first major CRPGs, the Baldur's Gates and so on, they really kind of like let you see everything. They let you know exactly what dice rolls are affecting, how the entire formula works. Then we have RPGs that keep things very straightforward. You know, you hit an enemy, all you get to see is you did 10 points of damage or enemy block. How much like what do you feel in terms of like conveying information to the player is either too much or not enough, especially in an RPG where, again, a lot of what you're going to be able to do is going to be built on these abstracted stats and values.
Yeah, I definitely think it depends on the game, for sure, and it depends on the type of players you're trying to get in. If you're trying to get in like the players who are a lot more like competitive, I guess you could say, the more information is probably good. First person perspective, for example, doesn't blend as well with like HUD elements appearing than in third person. In ArdenFall, we don't show any of that information. However, we're shifting towards showing more information with like VFX, and that's kind of pretty standard, right? Like, oh, I did an extra hard hit, flash this damage. It doesn't tell you the exact numbers, but at least communicates that something cool happened, and you usually be able to figure out like what that actually means. And I think that's where a lot of games have gone at this point, is less numbers and less like literal text and numbers, and more animations, sounds, particles. Yeah. And then when now for us, when you're looking at the weapon, we do want to show that information though, and that's what Jared's mentioned. Jared in the chat is one of the developers, by the way. He is one of our writers. He's the lead writer, in fact. Yeah. When you're looking at the weapon, it does show you all the stats, and that's important for us. But just clearing the HUD is something that's been important for us, where we don't want to have like a list, and this is another thing that people complain about in RPGs, and actually just AAA games in general, where there's just too much clutter. It's telling you like, what should I do next? It just tells you everything, right? Like the current quest, and the Witcher medallion's there on screen all the time for some reason, and everything is there, and I'm not a fan of that. I prefer less information. Quest markers is obviously another thing that people talk about. Yeah,
Yeah, and to Jared's point as well, like, and to what you were saying, there, I think, has to be like somewhere for games like this where you just go like all grognard on the stats, and you show this weapon does 10 to 15 physical damage. It has an attack speed of half a second of swing, and that stuff is important. But then, as we were saying, another big point about, I think, how modern game design has evolved has been making the main HUD, or the main screen, very streamlined. You want the player to kind of get all the information kind of through what is happening, as opposed to kind of having to check up here, okay, did the log say that I got a critical hit? Did this miss? And that kind of goes, again, like I'm sure you're aware of, and it's the chat, like there was that error of kind of CRPGs where you had that log in the bottom right-hand corner, the top right. So it's kind of like, you see your guy swing, and then it says miss. Or he swings again, critical hit does 700 damage. And like everything that's happening over here is just kind of like fluff. Like it's not even really important. It's just this little box that's telling you your fate.
Yeah, that's a really funny way of putting it, but it's true, and I think I really like the logs for turn-based games. I think it's great because you can add. It's so easy to add more fluff. You blew up his head. I don't have to add. Like, we don't have to spend thousands of dollars to have a blowing up your head system, right? Like it's and that's another thing that we could talk about, is just how we use text in dialogue to extend our graphics in a way. But yeah, it is pretty funny. The difference between action RPG. You can't really do that. You can't have a log in an action RPG. I mean, you can, but no one's gonna be looking at that when they're like, "Oh, swing, miss, dodge." Like that's pretty hard.
Mm-hmm. And with kind of, I guess, like conveying information to the player, one of the other aspects that we kind of been touching on, but I want to ask about with ArdenFall specifically, what happens, I guess, with like non-combat related options? We brought up like being able to talk to people and having different conversations, but I guess like what else can the player do in the world that's not directly like combat focused?
Yeah. So that's something we're wanting to extend. But currently, exploration is kind of the main thing you're doing in the world if you're not in combat or like doing a specific quest. That can involve interacting with objects that will open basically interacting with objects, which is essentially dialogue as well, where it tells you, and you might have certain options, and if you have a certain trait, maybe you can fix this item. You know,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it won't even do anything like major. Maybe no one will talk about it, but you can do it. Stealing is, of course, something you can do as well. Sneaking into someone's house and taking their stuff. Um, we bringing interactivity into the world isn't for me just about like you get this cool thing or it's like this big deal. Sometimes it's as simple as you go into a house and you open the oven and there's like a
Mm-hmm.
meat inside and you can take it. Sometimes as simple as that, where it feels like, oh, and you can put lore into that. Maybe it's not meat. Maybe it's some sort of, unique dish to the region. And now that's lore, right? Now you're teaching the people
Mm-hmm.
about the world. Or maybe there's nothing because they're starving. So you can make the world interesting, and tell a story. Also, I guess books would be another example of interactivity and also just what you can do. We have books all over the world that you can read, full of lore. All the lore is from the perspective of people in the world. So there might be a history book, but is it true? Is this book written by some guy in this empire not biased at all? I don't know about that one. So yeah, you that's what I would say is like the biggest ones. Is
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned like books and lore because that was going to actually be my next question for you. Let me see. As a quick time check, we are just over an hour in. Trying to think if there's any other questions for chat. If you do have any questions for Josh about Ardenfall on RPG design, definitely feel free to let them in or put them in. I think other than that, maybe like another 10-15 minutes if that works for you.
Sounds good.
So, with regards to the design of the game, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you would like to discuss?
Um, Design. I think. Jared, is there anything else that I missed? Yeah, we hit a lot of really good points. I guess dungeon design would be something where we're trying to make dungeons unique. Making dungeons unique is very it takes a lot of time, and we don't have it all the time in the world. We don't have a lot of teams, so there's always the question of like, how can we how could we do this in such a small team? That's kind of always the question, right?
Mhm.
Um, so our approach is like not to have a million dungeons, but instead to have a smaller number of dungeons, but they're big, big. I mean, where you could spend several hours in a dungeon, delving into the depths, finding secrets. You probably won't find everything in the first try, that kind of thing. One thing we're wanting to add in the future is those interactables that I've been talking about, where you might find a wall that requires a fire spell to activate it. And if you don't have a fire spell, too bad, right? It's a secret. Secrets are allowed to have those weird locks. If it's like the core, you should be able to get through the dungeon no matter what. That's kind of our general. Sorry, someone's
Mhm.
calling me. Our general idea. But secrets, all bets are off. And I don't. If you have to be like level 100 with a fire spell and a pitchfork, and that's all required, there it is. That's the requirement.
Mhm. Yep. And then that can become very frustrating for, kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about designing the world around a variety of solutions. And if you make it too rigid in terms of you must use specifically this fire spell and this ice spell, or this entire dungeon is completely messed up, people are going to get annoyed, unless, of course, people will say, oh, that's fine, I just preemptively know to have every skill or every spell available.
Yeah, and yeah, so for the getting through the dungeon, you should be able to do anything. You should be able to just be you. Yeah, and to be fair, the exactness is usually not the approach we go to. Usually it's more like you need fire of some kind. And we do have a system that lets different objects essentially have elements attached to them, and then those elements do other things. And we haven't used it too much, but we do have it where if it starts raining, the fire will go out. But that also means if you shoot a water or a frost spell at it, it will go out. I've seen some fun stuff where I have like an ice spell, and a fire mage is shooting fire at me, and I shot an ice spell, and it like melted their fireball. And I didn't even do that on purpose. I did not program that. It's just the fact that, when this fireball hits water or fire, water or ice, it melts. So that's a fun approach. Yeah.
One thing that I didn't ask you that just popped in my head is enemy design. Enemies in RPGs can certainly run the gambit, not only just in terms of stats, but what they're able to do as opposed to what the player can do. You mentioned earlier about having, or going to have like higher challenges, special enemies, that kind of thing. What has been kind of like the approach, or like what kind of philosophy are you taking with building the enemies for ArdenFall?
Yeah, our enemies kind of go in two different branches: the humanoid enemies and the non-humanoid enemies. Humanoid enemies, they're allowed to use weapons. They're allowed to use potions, at least in theory. And that can be pretty fun because we can just program it once and it'll just apply to a bunch of humanoids, which is pretty convenient. And for those guys, we usually just try to make it so they can do a lot of stuff, and then we try to give them fun stuff. And it's usually pretty easy to do in the sense of like, we know this spell does damage at this distance, so it'll kind of just automatically work. So basically, we can give this type of like generic spell type, like a projectile spell. We can just give that to an enemy. We know that they can cast that spell. And they can figure out whether it's worth it or not based on the calculations. So, a humanoid enemy can drink a health potion, can shoot a bow, can shoot a lot of spells, obviously use weapons. You start throwing knives. In terms of the non-humanoid design, usually we go from the approach of what do we need to make this area make the enemies feel different. So we might have a bunch of like melee enemies, essentially is what you would call them. Enemies that do damage at a close distance, and that's their focus. And then we'll decide, okay, we need an enemy that can shoot at a distance. And usually we've been trying to bring in more like effects into that. So like fire, water, whatever it is, to make it interesting as well. Having enemies have different attacks as well is pretty important, where, a big choreographed smash, where you can dodge it, that kind of thing is pretty important. We're still fleshing out enemies and enemy design as well, trying to make them more interesting and unique from each other.
Okay, and I guess to extend to that, or to build off of that, in terms of equipment design or like gear progression, this is another thing that RPGs have had very different takes in terms of what they want the player to grow in power. You have some games that go for a very kind of linear progression. You go from a wooden sword to a steel sword to a silver sword, and we just keep going up in sword materials. And then there are games that typically go for like very few types of armor or very few types of weapons, but they're very pronounced. Like if you go from wearing, let's say, leather armor to chainmail, it's like a 10 times improvement. But we're not going to give you, 5 to 10 different kinds of armor. With ArdenFall, how are you approaching like the equipment design or equipment-based progression?
I'd say probably in the middle. We don't have a million different types of weapons.
Hmm.
We do have a good number. Just the demo alone has, well, the demo alone I think has three per armor type. We have light and heavy armor,
Hmm.
um, and that's just one region. So that scales to at least six per character type. If you want to do heavy armor, six types of heavy armor, and pretty linear would be the idea. But I would say the factor that extends that is the slight randomization to stats, where you'll find this iron helmet, but maybe it will be 1 point better, right? So you swap it
Hmm.
out. Cool. It's basically a free way for the player to feel good about getting an upgrade without costing anything for us. And then the next way is enchantments, where you find a different enchanted item. Yeah, those are the
Hmm.
biggest ones for us.
Randomly adjusting stats, that's another thing that I've seen very different takes on in terms of how games are balanced around that. Where some games, like one of the issues that Diablo 3 ran into was that the stat variance was so wide. It was like this weapon could either do 50 points of damage or could do 750 points of damage. And then there's, of course, I guess this also gets into kind of the playability of RPGs. There's that tendency for some RPGs to kind of hit you with so much that you're just constantly having to stop and start again in terms of checking your gear. Oh, this guy dropped another sword. Let me stop for 20 seconds to make sure it's different from my sword. Let me keep going. And I've played a few action RPGs in particular that kind of like, you kill an enemy and here's 65 different weapon drops. It's like, okay, I gotta look over 65 items, then I take another step, here's another 35. And again, I think it goes back to that issue we were talking about in terms of how much do you actually want the player to have access to at any given moment. Because if you make it too light, and it just feels like, okay, I get a sword, and now I get no other armor or gear upgrades for 15 hours, they're going to get bored of that.
Right. Yeah, the demo is a bad example of this, where we, as I mentioned, greatly increased drops.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say like exactly what we want, because it's all up to kind of just balancing and testing for the full game. But since our game is loot based, trade based, where an important component of the gameplay
Mm-hmm.
loop is to go into a dungeon, get loot, and then sell it to get gold, to then or trade it rather,
Mm-hmm.
to then get better loot. Um, so it's not always just about, I found a cool sword, is it better than mine? Although that's something you always want to check. It's also, is this thing like not too heavy versus its value, so then I can sell it. Um, yeah, hard to
Mm-hmm.
say like exactly what we want, but we don't want to just spew out items. It makes them feel useless, which is what the demo does.
Mm-hmm. And to Avery's question in chat, do you have any plans on doing something interesting with like your death mechanic or death system?
Yeah, we've talked about it internally, but probably not. We have a quick save system. Um, so the idea is, you die, you reload your save. It's probably going to be as simple as that. Speaking of quick save, a system we removed for the demo, because we just wanted players to be able to save instantly, is the concept of not being able to quick save. You can quick load, but to save, you have to basically rest. So you have to sit down, press a button
Mm-hmm.
to sit down, have no enemies around you, and then you can save. And the
Mm-hmm.
thought process behind that is to reduce the number of times people just spam save, essentially. Because otherwise, you know, you, you know exactly what I'm talking about, where you have nothing to lose, and that kind of sucks. It's this hard balance where you want players to not just lose all their work, that sucks, but you also want players to feel like they're fighting for something. They can't just reload a save and instantly get back 2 seconds to where they were.
Mm-hmm. And again, that also goes back to how much loss you want the player to feel. Because another killer of these games, of course, is you forget to save, you just play for like the last hour or two, got randomly killed, and then you realize you just lost 2 hours of progress.
Yeah, yeah, then that's where autosave would come in. In the demo, there's no autosave unless you go into a dungeon. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we've definitely seen players lose a lot of work, and that yeah, I don't want anyone to lose an hour of playtime. That just suck. That's not fun at all.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's always interesting how games like handle different things. I was just thinking of this game Shadow Tactics. It was kind of like a almost like a tactical like real timing, kind of like the Commando style game. And what they would do was like once you got above like 5 minutes of a save, it would actually like pop up on the UI saying it has been over 5 minutes since you use a quick save. Maybe you should use a quick save now, or something like that.
That's a clever way to do it. In a non, I'm guessing it was non-action.
No, it was definitely heavy thinking, heavy
Yeah. That's
get
good for that kind
get
of game. Yeah,
characters in their right spot and do the thing, or you're never going to get through it.
yeah, yeah. And I a lot of modern, actually, pretty much all modern games have dropped quick save at this point. Um, and like for console, like it's a fact. You're not gonna have a, at the very least, you're not gonna be able to save files individually, right? That's
Hmm.
really rare in modern games. Um, and I obviously understand the appeal. The idea is like the game designers get to control when you save the game. That's cool for them,
Hmm.
and they can control the experience, and the players don't have to worry about saving. But I like being able to have save files. I really do. Being able to control and being able to just go back. That's the thing. Like in a lot of modern games, you have like one save file essentially. You walk through that door, the game's going to autosave, and that's it. That's your save file now.
Hmm.
Um, which I think is kind of a turnoff for testing the game, right? Like just
Yeah.
like seeing what you can do, seeing what you can break. Um, yeah.
Let's see. Avery is asking, is save something going to be a big part of the experience, and how much of a role will combat play in exploration?
Combat in exploration. I would probably say combat in a way can funnel you into areas depending on your level. Since like we've mentioned, it's a game where the enemies don't scale with you, so that means there will be hard areas, there'll be easy areas. So the average player will probably kind of find themselves in a hard area and then be destroyed. So in a way, that does affect exploration in the sense that it directs exploration until
Mhm.
later, and then you'll go there. Um, Combat, play, and exploration. Yeah, I yeah, I think that answers that.
All right. Um, I guess in terms of like wrapping things up, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to ask you. I guess another big question regarding pacing of ArdenFall and just pacing in RPGs in general. We've seen again RPGs in the past having 80 to 100 hours plus of content. At this point, Skyrim, who knows what the actual amount of time you could spend in that game with all those mods.
Oh
With
yeah.
something like with Orenfall, like what are you like guesstimating, or what are you trying to shoot for in terms of, I guess, like the overall length of the experience?
Yeah. No promises at all. Like this is totally what we're shooting for. I would say probably 20 to 30 hours is a very fair number. A good goal for us eventually to hit for one save file. And the main one of the main pillars, as I mentioned, is replayability. And that's something that we're really trying to push. And one question is, how do you communicate that to players? And that'll be interesting to figure out because players don't necessarily know that they can play the game and get a whole different experience. One way is the guilds. Like, they join a guild and there's all this experience inside this guild. They'll know that, oh, the other guilds are like different. That's cool. I should replay the game. Um, so yeah. Our goal is to have a good number of hours, but not massive, because we actually want you to play the game again, and again and again, in a very different experience.
Even some games will oftentimes spell it out, saying if you side with so and so, this is point of no return. That's another popular term I'm sure everyone here has heard many times in RPG style games, the infamous point of no return. And it is, I think, very important for it. I think to your point, it's sometimes hard to convey that unless you just outright say, you do this, all this is now locked off for this play. We want you to replay it again.
Yeah, that's a very classic way to do it, and that's honestly not a bad way. I should probably write that down because it is a good point. Yeah, communicating just straight up is definitely an interesting way to do it. In Morrowind, if you kill like an important character, it'll basically say in like very fancy lore ways, you screwed up. The main storyline's broken now. Um, that's always an interesting way of doing it. It's just telling them, like letting them, but telling them.
Yeah, but I think it is important to let them know in some capacity because you don't want them to accidentally kill the major quest person and then it's wondering, well, why have I not been able to move the story forward in the last hour?
Yeah, communication is so important, and it's easy to miss. It's hard. Communicating is hard,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of modern games skip the communicating and just go for locking down the experience,
Yeah.
which works. You don't need to communicate anymore if you can't kill that important character, right?
Yeah.
You smooth out all the hard edges to the point where the player cannot screw up. There's no way that the player can screw up in any way, which is a smooth experience, but whether it's actually fun is really the big question. And for me, I like to break things. I like to break the rules. So
Yeah.
that's just less fun for me.
Yeah, I think what you just said there, like smoothing the rough edges, I think that's a really good point about kind of like how so much modern RPGs or just modern design has really evolved too, and why games like Elden Ring can kind of like sneak in. Because that game is a lot of hard edges for anyone who has played that. And again, like going back to what I was saying earlier about dungeon crawlers, it's very much the same thing for me. Like, one of the things that always drives me crazy is you give the player all these different skills and abilities and then just say, oh, well, the boss or their all the enemies are just immune to them. So, oh, well, why put points into that? And it goes, I think, to what you were saying earlier about having like different spells and different weapons, that you want to give the player options that feel meaningful. That there is a difference between using an axe versus using a sword, from using a fire spell to an ice spell. And your example about being able to like melt like water or ice magic and stuff like that, I think that definitely leads, I think, in some direction to like the immersive sim style. And that is definitely like super duper advanced. Like that could easily be like another hour of us talking if we get on the ImSim line.
Really. Yeah, yeah, and I've definitely gotten ideas from yeah, those type of games. Dishonored and Deus Ex, and yeah, totally. And they're related, right? Choice, that's important. In different
Mhm.
ways, they have their own. They're totally a different genre, but yeah, and I've definitely, yeah.
All right. So I think to wrap things up, then just some very quick kind of like logistics related questions for you, and then we will say goodnight. So I guess the first one then is, so as you said earlier, you've been working on the game now for like and like full tilt like for about 2 years now. In terms of where it's at progress wise for people watching, what is like kind of like the current state? You mentioned the demo. I'll include a link, or there's a link to the store page in the show notes already. So for everyone watching, you can go there and check things out. But like, what is kind of like in the game as of right now?
In the game, so in the demo, we have a large city. It's the second largest city planned in the game, so it's a big location with 47 NPCs, I believe. Um, and then there's, I think, 4 dungeons. Currently, internally, we're working on the second town, which is going to be wrapped up pretty quickly. And then we have like 4 more dungeons. Moving on from this, we're going to be working on basically one major location, and then several smaller major locations, and then a handful of dungeons essentially. We're going towards early access. We don't have an actual date yet for the early access release, but yeah, we're zooming towards that now. Now that we have kind of found our stride in a way.
All right. And something tells me this question may be too big to answer right now. But when you do go into early access, you have an idea of how long you're planning on putting it in, or will be kind of like relative to like what feedback you're getting.
Definitely relative to feedback to an extent. We don't want to stay there too long. We're not trying to be a 7 days to die where we're just perpetually in early access. We want to have a point where we can say, yeah, this is the game, and we'll want to continue to update the game after early access. I would say probably a year in early access would be ideal.
Hmm.
It totally depends though. That could totally change depending on feedback.
Hmm. See. Uh, okay. Yeah, so every time about I think getting stuck with blocking, and that's always that challenge when it comes to like real time RPG or real time games like that in terms of how many defensive options you give the player. And I guess as like one final point for me, like I think it's one of the reasons why I gravitate towards like the third person action RPGs, the Souls games, and so on, is that you're really given I think a lot of I guess agility based ways to get around enemies, and you can't really I think do that as well in first person. You can't be showing like dodge rolling in first person
Oh yeah.
without causing a vertigo issues for the people watching.
Yep, that's one of the hardest parts of combat in first person is the lack of agility options. We've been experimenting with some sort of dodge.
Hmm.
Not actually rolling because that would be
Hmm.
terrible. But like Overwatch with McCree, he has a kind of a swoop dodge thing,
Hmm.
so it can be done. Yeah, it's definitely very limited, and it's just so painful knowing that if it's only this game was in third person, where like when there's a big enemy that's chasing you in third person, you can just run away but still be looking at the enemy, which is
Hmm.
so useful, right? You'll see when he's about to attack, so you can dodge then. But in a first person game, the only way is to kite. If you want to be looking at enemy and moving, you're basically kiting,
Hmm.
meaning you're running into who knows what. It's not it's a difficult thing. But we are wanting to add more ways to dodge than just moving. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, for sure.
Uh,
And yeah, Avery was saying that he was confused about the dagger, and yeah, it's just a thing where daggers don't block. It's just a way to make weapons feel different.
yeah. And of course, I think it may be useful to put that on like the UI or something like what weapons
Yep.
are have blocks, what
Yes.
weapons don't.
Totally. Yep. Communication.
Hmm.
We're needing to add so much more information to each weapon and stuff. We've learned that because to us it's obvious, right? I programmed it. Of course, I know daggers don't double
Yeah.
block, but obviously no one else does. How would they know? So yeah, totally, absolutely.
And with like having like a simulating like a dodge in first person, I know Doom Eternal did that with kind of like that. It like kind of like has like
Yeah.
how to move in like really fast left and right, that kind of thing.
hmm Yeah, and Cyberpunk does as well. And I've experimented with that. We ran into issues because I'm making it so like you double tap the D to go to the right, and that wasn't really fun. You accidentally click it and then you just like fall off a cliff or something. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I am open to that, and I'm wanting to add something like that because I think it is nice.
Yeah. And to Avery's comment, there's a giant village. Yeah. Again, like that first thing you do after the tutorial, I think going to I don't know what you were just saying in terms of information. That is always I think that make or break point for a lot of these games. Like one of the things that has always kept me out from playing like the grand kind of like space RPG stuff like was it Star Rangers or Space Rangers? There's a that whole genre kind of like the really I guess open world space RPG is that you finish a tutorial, you're given like the entire universe, and you're just sitting there going, "What the heck am I supposed to be doing right now?" I'm just like this little tiny dot here on the entire universe. And again, to your point, it always has to, I think, go back to information. What are you conveying to the player as to how they're supposed to be going?
Yeah, yeah, and it's true that the space games take this issue with RPGs and just magnifies it to a million.
Mm.
Um, yeah, it's really about communicating what the designer kind of figures you'll do, and also what you can do. Right? Oh, there's a store, right? Merchant. Okay, communicating that early is really good, and something we don't do in the demo. We actually added a character who kind of basically tells you what you can do as a
Mm-hmm.
band-aid. Uh, and for that very reason, where communicating just things you can do also helps. Um, yeah, I've been playing Dwarf Fortress, the UI version on Steam, and I've played the non UI version as well. But it's much easier to get into it when you actually can see your dwarf instead of it being an ASCII character. But
Mm-hmm.
it had a tutorial, and then it ends, and it's just kind of like, oh, okay, I guess I'll just fiddle around.
Yep.
Um, There's one thing that is really cool though that I found is it actually has more tutorials that you're not forced to go through, which is cool. It has a lot of information that's pretty helpful, and also when you open up a new panel, it'll often show up a little tutorial message.
Mm-hmm.
So the tutorial kind of continues afterwards, which is pretty clever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, that to Thorne's comment, it is always that difficulty of, yes, to someone who's played every Elder Scrolls game, they know exactly what all this stuff means, and you don't want to pick up every single book or every kitchen utensil you see. But getting that to someone who's never touched the genre, who has no background in it, that, again, I could rant here for another hour about onboarding. I have a roundtable I'm trying to get with some more strategy designers on that very topic. But it is such a hard thing when you're trying to build this game and you're trying to make it so that if someone has never touched an RPG, they've never even for some reason heard of Elder Scrolls before they play your game, can they figure it out?
Yep, that's one of the hardest things. I would say that's one of the hardest things in game design when you're making a game that's more complicated than like a platformer. Is just communicating all of that. Yeah, in an open world, there's so many features. How do you communicate all that?
Oh, yes. And again, like, to Avery's comment, like, you could miss a sign somewhere. Like, if you missed that one sign, or you didn't see that one light over there that's supposed to guide you to the opening scene, you just went left, and you end up somewhere in, like, the poison swamps of a Dark Souls game, the player is just going to quit at that point. They're not going to want to reload and go, well, maybe I should have gone right. And, again, like, world design, UI, UX design, all this stuff not only matters in a single player game, but as you said, it gets magnified when you're not holding the player's hand, when you're not saying that you're going to level 1 and then to level 2. It's just basically, here's this entire space, go, and that can be very daunting.
Totally.
I guess, other than that, you mentioned, of course, like how long you're hoping to be in early access. Do you see yourself porting ArdenFall to other platforms? Is that in the cards, or is it going to stick to PC?
Currently, PC only. I'd like to port it, but that's a different aspect than actually porting. Yeah, currently is PC.
All right. So I guess, but with that said, I asked this earlier, but anything else that we did not touch on yet, or you would like to bring up about anything regarding ArdenFall?
No, I think that's basically it. I think we went over a lot of good stuff here.
Thank you, Avery. Yeah, a lot of trees. Now what? For me, that's with space. Is replaced that with stars, and that's how all my experience with space RPGs have ended. But yeah, this has been a really great chat. I may try and bug you about some RPG questions as I'm writing this book, because there's a whole lot that I'm going to be going over here. But
yeah,
it has been a lot of fun. I do wish you and Jared and anyone else on the design team good luck with the rest of ArdenFall and getting it to early access.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right, so I guess my final thing then for like social media plugs is: do you have anything you'd like to say to fans watching? Any final points on RPG design? Any final thoughts in general?
I'd probably just say play the demo. We'd love to get feedback. We do listen to everything people say. Joining our Discord helps with that. Yeah. Also wishlist us.
All right. So for people watching this, besides the store page I have in the show notes, any other social media links, anything like that you would like to promote?
Nope. Well, yeah. I mean, the biggest one is just the Steam page, which you've linked down below. That's the big one. Yeah, that's really it, honestly.
All right. So, I think with that, we'll wrap things up for this chat. Again, it is always great to talk to another Josh in the game industry. Confuses the heck out of the audience, so they never know which one to talk to. But like I said, I do wish you guys the best of luck, and when it gets into early access, I'll be happy to give ArdenFall another check.
All right, sounds good.
All right, so for everyone watching, we're going to end our cast here. There you go, Ari. But thank you everybody for tuning in. For those of you watching this live, I will be going into my regular game stream after maybe a 10 to 15 minute break and refilling my drinks. For everyone watching this recorded, be sure to do the liking, subscribing, and commenting. Again, check out ArdenFall. The store page is in the description down below. And Josh, if you are free in the future, come back on and talk RPGs or the state of ArdenFall, let me know, and I'll be happy to welcome you back.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, so everyone, thanks again for tuning in. Come back for the discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. And for the record folks, have a good night. For the live folks, I will see you all in a few minutes. Take care.